We begin with the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. Kyiv says its forces are sustaining heavy losses as Russia steps up its assault in the east, though the Ukrainians maintain that Russian losses are worse. Thousands of civilians, including those trapped inside the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, are hoping to be evacuated to safety, following speculation about a deal brokered with Russia by the UN Secretary-General.
Buses waiting to evacuate civilians from Liman in Ukraine's east. What was once a quiet rural town is now on the front line of an offensive by Russian forces trying to move towards the city of Kramatorsk. Ukraine's government claims it has inflicted losses on Russia's military. That's impossible to verify, but these images show how the war is taking a heavy toll on non-combatants. As for the civilian population, nearly all areas along the front line between the Ukrainian forces and the separatists are being shelled. Some areas further away have also been targeted. Further west in Kyiv, emergency workers sift through an apartment building hit by a Russian missile. The blast killed one resident, a journalist from Radio Liberty, and injured several more. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, seen here presenting medals to service personnel, said the attack was an attempt by Russia to humiliate the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who was visiting Kyiv at the time. This footage released by Russia's Ministry of Defense purports to show artillery firing on Ukrainian positions. Again, verifying when or where it was filmed is impossible. But as the West rushes to arm Ukraine, it indicates Russia is gearing up to continue fighting.
So increased shelling in Ukraine's east and elsewhere across the country. DW correspondent Emmanuel Shaz can bring us the latest from Lviv in western Ukraine. Welcome, Emmanuel. Let's start with what you're hearing about today's attacks.
Well, Phil, the attacks continue mainly against the eastern part of Ukraine. In fact, we've got warning apps on our phones, like every person here in Ukraine can see when the airstrike alerts start, there's sirens starting, and they come every day. Here we're a bit sheltered in the east, but in the west, but in the east, this is almost continuous. For example, the province of Donetsk has been on high alert all day long, the night before as well. So this is just really taking its toll also on civilians, not only on Ukrainian armed forces, which are fighting the Russian army, but also on civilians. I would like to give you some figures. We were talking in the report about Mariupol. Mariupol had 400,000 inhabitants before the start of the war. This is down to 100,000 inhabitants now, and today we got some figures about the toll this war had, the impact this war had on civilians. 20,000 people, civilians, are counted dead now. That's the mayor who gave those figures. 600 people have been injured over the past few days during the shelling of the Azovstal steel plant, and it was also mentioned earlier. There's still hundreds of people who are trapped in that steel plant, not only Ukrainian armed forces, but also civilians, up to 1,000 civilians who are still not evacuated.
Let's talk about the Mariupol then and that steel plant, because there had been hopes that the UN Secretary-General had negotiated some sort of safe passage for people there. So what is the latest? What's happening there?
Well, Ukraine said again that it was hopeful that humanitarian evacuation would take place. But Phil, we've been there. We've been hearing about those humanitarian corridors for weeks now. And although a few dozens of people had been evacuated from Mariupol, every single time those discussions, those negotiations end up just falling apart. chiefly because there's a renewed shelling, and even like NGOs working on the ground say that unless there is a ceasefire of 24 or 48 hours during which civilians could themselves leave by themselves and themselves choose where they would be going, this is not going to happen. Evacuations will not happen in those conditions.
Well, and President Zelenskyy has been calling on the idea of talks with Russia as well.
Exactly, but you know, Phil, last night, the entire, Thursday night, Ukraine in its entirety was under airstrike alert. Kyiv, the capital, has been hit, just as Antonio Guterres from the United Nations was in Kyiv to talk to Volodymyr Zelenskyy. So there's absolutely no trust between the two parties, which renders the negotiations, of course, very difficult, and it shows no sign to getting any better, with the fighting continuing all over the country.
Thank you for that, Emmanuel. DW correspondent Emmanuel Shaz in Lviv. Well, the historic city of Odesa has so far largely been spared in this conflict, but Russia's military says it aims to capture what is Ukraine's biggest port. Russian forces will have to contend with Odesa's residents. Thousands are now getting ready to defend their homes.
Assembling and disarming an AK-47, skills these people in Odesa would never have imagined needing. But now, they must familiarize themselves with the weapons they may need to defend their city. I came here because I realized that I need to protect my country. We are all needed, men and women, because you don't know what will happen tomorrow. More than 5,000 volunteers have signed up at paramilitary centers like this one. They are being trained in urban combat tactics, weapons handling, and military strategy. Those who want to continue can train with territorial defenses or even the army. We are training people who want to be sure they know how to help in extreme situations. That is why we are now teaching them basic combat and first aid. Those who aren't taking up arms are taking up shovels. People have been covering up Odesa's many monuments with sandbags to protect at least its symbols from war.
Let's take a look at some more stories related to this war. Indonesia's President Joko Widodo says the leaders of Russia and Ukraine have agreed to attend the G20 summit his country is hosting in November. Some Western countries have pushed for Russia to be banned from the organisation. Russia has begun preparations for its Victory Day parade on the 9th of May. Military vehicles filled central Moscow to practice for the annual commemoration of victory against Nazi Germany. It's thought Vladimir Putin is pressing for a breakthrough in Ukraine before the ceremony.